Hello, good people. This is Sister Julia Walsh, and you're listening to Messy Jesus Business. Welcome to the Mass. I'm here with Cyrus Habib, who is a Jesuit scholastic, an educator, spiritual director, and a former politician who served as the 16th Lieutenant Governor of Washington from 2017 to 2021. He is both the first and only Iranian-American official to hold statewide elected office in the United States. He is a graduate of Columbia University, Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, and Yale Law School. He is also an advocate and friend to the poor and oppressed. Cyrus, welcome to Messy Jesus Business.
Great to be here with you, Julia.
Thank you for making time for this. I would love to just jump right in and hear, how did you become a Jesuit? How did you discern that this was how you were called to live your life and be who you are?
Well, let me back up even further than that and tell you how I became a Catholic.
Yes, please.
Yeah, so I grew up in what I call a generically monotheistic household.
Mm-hmm.
My parents were both immigrants from Iran. They came here, as most immigrants do, in search of economic and educational opportunities. They were both born in Iran. And my dad went to Seattle, studied undergrad and graduate school in engineering. And my mom joined him later at the time of the revolution in Iran, the Islamic Revolution.
Mm.
I was born in Maryland in 1981. You know, growing up, I was always taught to believe in God, but my parents were not practicing Muslims.
Mm-hmm.
They did grow up in very secular Muslim families, but I was always taught to have great respect for all religions. Now, Catholicism did end up playing a role in our family in a kind of interesting set of ways. One is that my mom had gone to Catholic schools and always felt a kind of attraction to the faith, although at that time she didn't convert. And then when I was growing up in Maryland, I had a number of health issues, which maybe we'll talk about. But, you know, Maryland is such a Catholic state, and probably even more so at that time, that our friends were almost all Catholic. And so they would take us with them to Mass, certainly at like Christmas and Easter. We visited at least once the shrine of Mother Seton, Elizabeth Ann Seton. And so that background was there. But we then moved to Seattle, which I think was just rated the most non-religious major city in America. And so religion was definitely not a part of my life then. Then I went to college in New York City at Columbia. Again, not a part of my life there either. It was when I was in graduate school at Oxford that a friend invited me 20 years ago to go to Mass at Blackfriars, which is the Dominican college at Oxford. If you knew me at that time, you would understand how preposterous the thought of my going to Mass was. And I was just not interested at all. And so I said, why would I ever want to do that? And he said, you don't need to come to pray. It's kind of medieval and creepy. I think you'll like it. And at Oxford, medieval and creepy is like the coin of the realm, right?
Uh-huh.
So I was like, just on an aesthetic level, I decided to join him. And it wasn't like a Damascene, conversion or anything like that. But I found myself wanting to go back. In large part, that was due to the preaching of Timothy Radcliffe, who perhaps many of your listeners know, former master of the Dominican order, a brilliant writer and theologian and spiritual leader in the church. So he was the regular presider at that Mass. And also I was drawn in by the beauty of the liturgy. That began my process of conversion. A couple of years later, I went through RCIA and was welcomed into the church.
I love it. I didn't know all that. It's so funny that you haven't told me that story before.
That's kind of like chapter one.
Uh-huh.
Let me tell you this. So it wasn't, you asked the question, how did I decide to become a Jesuit?
Yeah.
And that's kind of like part one. But I also have to share a bit about what I did before I became a Jesuit in order for your listeners to understand, how the ultimate discernment went. So I went to law school, I practiced law, and then I went into politics and ended up serving in Washington State, in the State House and the State Senate, and then ultimately as the Lieutenant Governor of the state. And it was during that time that even as my political career was going really well, increasingly for a whole bunch of reasons, I started to feel that there was something missing.
Mm-hmm.
I ended up reading Jim Martin's A Jesuit Guide to Almost Everything. That was suggested to me by my pastor, Father Mike Ryan of St. James Cathedral in Seattle. And that planted some seeds. That was back in 2013 that I read that book, although I often compare it to like when you go on vacation somewhere and you tell yourself, like, I could really see myself living here, but it's just kind of theoretical. You don't really have a plan to pick up and move to that city. That's kind of how I felt about religious life. Like, it seemed attractive and it seemed kind of almost idyllic. But back in the real world, things were going in a different direction. I was winning higher office. I was getting all this recognition. It wasn't until after my father passed away of cancer in 2016, and I had some health challenges of my own in 2018, that I started to really seriously discern.
And what did that discernment look like? Like, how did it work? How did you do it?
Again, I give a lot of credit to James Martin, because around that time, he had started a podcast version of the Examen.
Oh, yeah.
Which can still be found anywhere where podcasts are distributed. And really what it is it's the same recording, but every week he'll do a little 2-minute reflection at the beginning, and then he walks you through the Examen prayer, which, for those who don't know, is a Jesuit prayer practice. Doesn't take very long. It's often prayed at the end of the day, where you review your day. You kind of go over your day with God, giving gratitude and looking for where God has been present in your day, where it was easy to notice God, where it was harder to notice God, and also looking for areas of growth in yourself, and also identifying where, other people's need for growth can be challenging. It's a really beautiful prayer practice that I think people who are on all different places in their spiritual journey, anyone could relate to it or could derive benefit from it. So I started praying the Examen. And what I noticed when praying the Examen was that all the things that are kind of central to political activity, like, introducing legislation, wrangling votes, fundraising, schmoozing, whatever, all of that stuff left me feeling kind of hollow, even though I was pretty good at it. And especially when like people would say things like, oh, he's going to be the next governor, or you should do this, or you should do that, all of which is like validating on its face, but it would leave me feeling kind of empty. At that same time, whenever I would do certain other things, like we started in my office just on the side, it's not central to what the lieutenant governor does at all, but we started a number of youth leadership programs for underserved kids in Washington State. That kind of thing would leave me feeling, the Ignatian term, as you know, is consolation. Like I would feel this closeness of God. One of my jobs as lieutenant governor was to preside over the state Senate. And every morning we would have a different spiritual leader, a priest, a rabbi, an imam, come and give the opening prayer invocation. And so I would take a few minutes before we started the Senate session just to get to know that person. And that also left me feeling this kind of pull, like these people seem happier than the politicians in this building. What's going on with that? A really kind of marquee experience was when I got a chance to go twice, actually, to India to meet with the Dalai Lama, once on my own and then once leading a delegation. And particularly the one that I had on my own, I was like, even though this is a different religious tradition, my admiration for him and for his teachings, like I've met presidents, and to me, this was like, okay, well, sometimes the way you discern is you figure out who your role models are, right? And you say, I want to live like that. And I've got a ton of respect for President Obama, respect for President Biden, President Clinton, so on. But it was it was this attraction to these men and women in religious life who had given their lives for something sublime and transcendent that in my prayer in the Examen, I kind of realized was calling me in a different direction.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's so beautiful. What I'm loving about what I'm hearing there, Cyrus, is how the formula is noticing, right? It's just about paying attention.
Absolutely.
If we are just awake and we're not like just going through the motions, but we are doing things with intention and paying attention, then we start to notice what things cause our hearts to feel alive, where we feel a sense of belonging, where we feel a sense of meaning. And right. And that
Yeah.
I think reveals to us our sense of purpose and call and like who we truly are. And I also like resonate with what you're talking about as far as like you were good at this thing. People were encouraging you to keep doing it and like continuing to climb the ladder. That wasn't actually satisfying you. I mean, it's very countercultural to resist that, right?
Yeah. And I think one of the things as I've started directing people, providing spiritual direction, one of the things I realize is that people often feel trapped. They often feel that they don't have that many options.
Yeah.
I think that's a sign of the converse of consolation, which is desolation, is when we feel like we only have, for example, two options and one of them seems impossible.
Yeah.
One of the ironies that demonstrates this, I went to what is often considered the top law school in the country, Yale Law School. And what's amazing is that the law students, the graduates who should have and do have every possible opportunity available to them, nevertheless still end up doing like four things. One of four things. And you see this in so many different, dynamics where people who, even though on paper they actually should be able to take risks, they do have a safety net, they do have the luxury to be able to try new and adventurous things, but they just don't feel that they can. And I'm not being naive. People, I do recognize that that's a luxury for some people. Many people don't have the ability to take risks, or huge career ones, I should say.
Right.
But even for those who have less privilege than I had at that point, I think still often miss the kind of, let's use the word that you highlight in the name of your podcast, which is the kind of messiness that exists.
Yeah.
And to try to move towards that and to recognize that God is working in that messiness. And in fact, God may even be able to affect us most when we allow ourselves to be in that messiness.
Yeah. I just had this thought of like, God uses the messiness of our lives to flirt with us, to kind of like lure us along and, reveal to us the power and the wonder.
Yeah. When we try to organize and sort everything in a certain way, that also closes off, avenues that in which God can journey with us.
I think I can say for myself, I'm trying to allow the Holy Spirit to be the wild animal she is, right? Like, I'm here to mess with you, Julia. You think you got control? Haha. Let me show you what I can do. And just like, hold on for the ride. We're going to go somewhere together and it's going to be amazing. This is not your show. This is not your game, Julia. And I think that's what you're talking about too, is like in this culture of ours, there's something about the way we're like conditioned and taught and socialized. I really think what we experience in the classroom really conditions us to strive for perfection and neatness and tidiness and an orderliness. And not that there's anything wrong with those things, but if they start to impact the way we understand discipleship and our spiritual life, right, then that becomes problematic because we're not living with a spirit of freedom and flexibility, which no matter how much privilege or power a person has, like you're talking about, they can still be trapped. They can truly feel trapped.
And I think the reality is that this is also an area where the church needs to grow, because I think the church also, for all kinds of historical reasons, has not always done a great job, or, to be honest, sometimes actually works against our ability to recognize the wildness of the Spirit.
Yeah.
as we record this, we're coming up on Holy Week, and then we'll have Easter and culminating in Pentecost. The birthday of the church is also a good opportunity to remember the wildness of the Spirit that animates and has since her birth, on that day, animated the church.
Yeah.
And each of us who are in communion.
Right. So, in light of all this, how do we collectively allow ourselves to be transformed? Like, yes, tradition is sacred and holy, but tradition is changing. What are your insights about how that dance works, and what is needed from those of us who are part of the church so that we can be obedient to the Spirit and not our own agendas?
Yeah, well, I think that's what Pope Francis is asking us to consider, right? Which is why, even though there can be a kind of meta element or valence to the synod on synodality, but the question that you asked is also kind of a meta question, which is like, how do we do the thing that allows us to know how to do the thing, right?
Right.
And that's what this is about, and it's really hard. And I have to say, like, there's days when, if I'm honest, I'm more pessimistic than others, and days where I'm more optimistic. But you use the word collective, and I think that's one aspect of it, is that, we're not just doing this on our own. We're doing it together. We're doing it in communion. We're moving forward together. What the Examen allows me to do in prayer is what I think synodality can allow us to do in global discernment, or in discernment in any level, which is recognize my prophethood, but also recognize your prophethood. Right? Like, so in the Examen, I can look over my day and say, you know what? That's when God was speaking through me. That's when I was being prophetic, which doesn't mean standing on a mountaintop or whatever necessarily. It's any time I'm living the gospel in a way that pushes me towards growth, and that witnesses to it, and hopefully also leads the way for others as well. That's the prophethood of my own prophethood that I can observe throughout my day, but it's also to be able to see the prophethood of others, and to be able to say, that person whom I met on the train, or, that colleague of mine at work, when they did X or Y, that was them doing Jesus's messy business, right?
Yeah.
That also then at the level of ecclesiology.
I want to define ecclesiology for the listeners.
Right. How the church is governed and operates and structured and all those things. Like that level, the synodal way is where, we can talk. We may disagree on this or that issue, but I need to recognize that I'm not the only prophet in the room. You're also being prophetic somehow, even if I think, oh my God, why is this thing that she's saying so wrong, so backwards, so off? That's my interpretation of it.
Yeah, you're on point, brother. It is. It's just as basic as, like, we build community by sharing with each other, by sharing our truth, our understanding, our perspectives. And when people share with us, we receive it as gift, and we reverence what they offer us, and we respect them as people, even though we may be uncomfortable or disturbed, or right. And to notice, oh, wow, I'm uncomfortable here, can actually be something that can increase our awareness of ourselves and how we're called to grow and change and move the group somewhere together.
And the humility to recognize that, like, Peter can get it 100% right and be totally prophetic and say, you are the Christ, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God, and then almost simultaneously get it wrong.
Right.
But then also a man who's possessed with demons, that same person can be a force of disruption and a channel for the evil spirit, but also can be the one who prophetically proclaims Christ's divinity, right? There's like a certain humility that says, like, I can be a prophet, and I am a prophet, I'm baptized a prophet, right? But also that doesn't mean that I'm always right, also like you may seem totally different than I am, and your values seem totally different, but that doesn't mean that you're always wrong.
Yeah. Yeah.
So that's messy.
It's so messy.
Yeah.
That's right.
Yeah.
Cyrus, earlier you referenced suffering that you've experienced in your life, your own medical challenges, your father's death in 2016. And I'd love for you to share how suffering has been a teacher for you. And in
Yeah.
particular, what has suffering taught you about holiness and contemplation, even humility, like you were just talking about, right?
So, I had cancer when I was 4 months old. That's the first time I had cancer. It was in the left eye. I had a rare childhood cancer called retinoblastoma, which took the eyesight in my left eye before I was 2 years old, and then came back again in the right eye, leaving me completely blind at age 8 years old. First of all, there was that. There was the cancer, the treatments, all of that as a child. Then becoming blind, which not only obviously has logistical dimensions and ramifications, but also social ones, which is that, I was different from other kids growing up. I had to deal with the expectations and prejudices that other people, and not just in the past, I still do, that people have about someone who's blind. And, I was really blessed to have parents who, despite not being experts in this field, at all, but were just believed so strongly in me, and that both that I should get the accommodations that I need, but that I shouldn't be overprotected or sequestered or whatever, that I could do whatever other kids were doing, even if I had to do it differently. And so, unfortunately, so much of how we deal with suffering is actually out of our hands and has to do with our family situation, what we learn from parents and teachers and guardians at a young age. If it's something like my situation, like a childhood disability, we take our cues from the adults. And I think even in other dynamics, like we get so many of those cues early on. It doesn't mean that it has to be our destiny forever, but it does really color our outlook. And so I give thanks for the great blessing of parents and teachers who believed in me. My mom used this phrase, we were so afraid, but we did not allow our fear to become your fear. That all of that said, I still, of course, do have my own fears. Later, I would be diagnosed with cancer again of a different type and have to be treated for that. And so my health, thank God, is good right now, but I live with the reality, having survived cancer several times, that none of us knows what tomorrow may bring. And that can be, for me, a real cause of anxiety. That even when I'm healthy, I have to allow myself to not worry or obsess about what if one day I'm not, or what will happen, or whatever. That doesn't mean that I should stop, monitoring my health and doing surveillance and all those things, but to do those things that are responsible without letting them dominate me.
Yeah.
That is like my cross. Not necessarily the only one, but I think the one that, as you ask this question, is front of mind for me, and I think will definitely accompany me my whole life. And how do I deal with it? I mean, I deal with it. The good news, the gospel, is that Jesus has been there. As I pray with Jesus in the garden, which is kind of like almost where we're at as we record this pod, like in the liturgical year, that's Jesus really praying this prayer that I'm sure many of us have prayed all the time, which is, please let this be okay in the way that I want it to be, and yet not what I want, but what you want.
Yeah.
But just registering that I would want this, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so it's that constant, like, we are told to pray to God for what we want in a petitionary way, but also to accept that we don't have all the information. So sometimes what I think about also is that, like, as Jesus came to understand that there would be suffering. Did he necessarily know when and how and what that would look like? And did that cause anxiety? That people who have to go for scans in a medical context, might be able to identify with. I don't know whether today is the day. Is today the day? Maybe that's how Jesus felt. There's these gospel passages where it says, but it was not his hour.
Yeah.
His hour had not yet come.
Yeah.
Right? And I sometimes wonder, but did he know that
right
until it worked out? Or did he think, is this my hour? That's how anyone who goes for MRIs or CT scans and these kinds of things, the people who've survived cancer or people who have cancer and are wondering whether their treatment is working, that's the question that's going through our minds is has my hour come or not? And so Jesus has been there. And Jesus also teaches us that worrying does not add a single moment to our lives. So by orienting our gaze onto a level of existence that cancer can't touch, that ought to be a source of comfort. And yet we are a little flock that is often afraid. I mean, we are sheep. It is in our nature to be afraid.
Yeah.
And so we try.
So we try not to worry. And it assures you that Christ himself didn't know when and how he was going to be suffering.
That's my interpretation.
How does suffering, though, create holiness? What is holiness?
What is holiness? I'm supposed to answer that question on this pod?
Yeah.
Well, what does suffering do for me?
Yeah.
At its best, suffering allows me to identify with others.
Yeah.
Right? Which is what we believe about Jesus' suffering. One of the things that you hear all the time in countless homilies. Well, St. Paul, right? We have a God who can identify with us, who does not hold. So that's Jesus. But that's also us. In our suffering, I don't know what it's like to deal with bipolar disorder. Personally, I don't, right? But on the other hand, I do know what it's like to be blind. I do know what it's like to have cancer. I do know what it's like to lose a parent. So those are experiences of suffering that soften my heart, hopefully, right? And they can often harden our hearts, right? So it is also important to say it's not automatic, but they can soften our hearts and open them to the suffering of other people so that we commiserate in this world. Maybe that's a part of holiness, when my wounds are open to your wounds and we can actually encounter one another through this sense, which is not one of the five senses, but it's not the eyes, the ears, the hands, but it's actually the wounds as a site of encounter.
Right. And now I'm imagining Thomas demanding to touch the wounds of Christ, right? And in that story, sometimes we emphasize Thomas's doubt. I love it because to me, it reveals how Thomas had such a desire for intimacy with Christ. Right. And he was a tactile person, right? And for him, being a disciple was an embodied thing. It wasn't just a mental thing. That sounds really like a great thing that God's back. I'll believe that with my mind, right? But no, he wanted to feel it. And so many of us, because we're humans, because we have bodies, we're made to feel things and to encounter the brokenness in other people and in ourselves. Yes, by God's design, it should increase and deepen our compassion. It should help us to be people who become more sensitive to others. Yeah. And also to care better for ourselves. But you're right. Sometimes we're so disturbed and we're so uncomfortable, we turn away from it and turn away from others, turn away from suffering. And that I would call sin.
I don't know. So often it's not voluntary, so often it's a result of fear, of deep distress, even of upbringing and of trauma. To say when one is a wounded wounder instead of a wounded healer, right? And so, it's a really hard thing. I'm not qualified theologically to answer it, because I do think, like,
I'll
it
talk to
is,
you later about that question.
it is, yeah. You'll teach, yeah, if you could teach me after the pod, but it's like it is by God's grace that people become wounded healers.
Yes.
We are called to cooperate with it. And yet I also have compassion for those who have been so wounded and maybe are, just haven't been shown that way. So we have to pray for that as well, and for all of those people. And we can all be that person too.
Yeah.
You know?
Right. More messiness.
Yeah.
What would you say are some of your biggest hopes for how the church, and I'm speaking about the people of God here, not the institution, right? How the church can better stir us into action, right? And be people of greater compassion, embracing and allowing like the diversity of who we are.
One thing that I know to be the case is that, we talk a lot about, and it is true that there are in the US, let's just say, because it's where you and I live, the levels of like mass attendance, church attendance overall are down. People are less and less affiliated with organized religion overall. But when you look at what young people, this is from my experience as a Jesuit, having taught high school and middle school for a bit in my formation, what I perceived is that what they value so greatly is authenticity.
Yeah.
And it's not just young people. I think we all do, but that is something that, whether one is churched or not, is so important to people. And so to me, another real aspect of the Examen as a prayer is like, how do you live most authentically? Did I live authentic? When were the moments I lived authentically today? And what I desired, this is like a very meandering way to get to your question, but what I desired when I was discerning a vocation was to live more authentically. Like, I go to mass on Sundays and this is what I'm taught, and I say this is what I believe, and I say the creed, but then what do I do the rest of the week? Am I living according to the values that I claim? I was confessing a faith that said, like, money, power, and respect are not what we're here for. But then I spent the rest of my week pursuing money, power, and respect. Not even so much money, but power and respect. So what I think those of us who do confess this faith and are like, okay, we are Christians, or we are Muslims, or we are Jews, or whatever it is. But like, for those of us who have religion as part of our identity, we absolutely should try to live. Was it Dorothy Day who said to live in such a way that our lives would make no sense if there were no God? I'm going to give it to Dorothy Day. I think I've also heard that it was the Archbishop of Paris in the 40s. But anyway, let's also give it to Dorothy Day. Like, do we really do that? Or do we even really try? Yeah. That's what people really respond to. Yeah. When they see people living in a way that inspires them, and where they say, man, these people really believe it. Yeah. I mean, when we look back at the early church, we often call to mind the martyrs. And we're like, okay, then that strengthens our faith, because we say, well, the people who were around, like the apostles, for example, like, they died. So this whole thing probably wasn't some big fabricated conspiracy theory that they just made up, because you might make it up to sell some books, but you're not going to make it up and then go and die for it, right? Yeah. So they died for it. That really tells me something about what they had experienced. Yeah. And so then I think for you and me who are in religious life, if we do it right, then people say, okay, well, whatever Cyrus and Julia have experienced, it's real enough that they're doing this, that they're living according to this way or that way. Mm-hmm. But that's not just for those who've taken these vows in this way, but for all of us. Yeah, and it's for our institutions. Like, do our Catholic universities just produce graduates who go into the same kind of sick, late-stage capitalist, highly commodified economy and do the same old? Or are they producing graduates of a different kind if they're calling themselves a Catholic university? Amen. Same for our Catholic high schools. If they're just mirroring what's out there, then you can't blame people then for becoming cynical
Right.
about what the gospel is offering.
Yeah. Oh my goodness. Cyrus, I wasn't actually expecting to talk about sort of the outcome of us being inspiring by just being ourselves, right? And
Yep.
like how that's actually a good thing. That was really helpful for me to hear you say all that, because recently with my book being out and people reading it and some talks that I've done here and there, the positive things I'm hearing are like, "Oh, you're so inspiring," or "This is so beautiful." And I'm like, I'm definitely uncomfortable with people calling me inspiring, because I just feel like I'm just trying to do what God called me to do. And that's what we all are supposed to do. Right. So I
Yeah.
try to like deflect it. But I think what you're naming there is like, if they're seeing God working in me and it's inspiring them to turn to God more, then I should just thank God for that. It's not about me, it's about God. And that's great.
Right. They see your prophethood, but as long as they then also can see their own prophethood, right? Like that.
Right.
Like, so one of the things that as a convert, I really, really try to tell my friends or people whom I've talked to about this sort of thing is like, people often think that like faith is something that you're just given and you either have it or you don't have it,
Yeah.
And it's not like, okay, I went to mass the first time or the 10th or the 50th time and all of a sudden it was given to me and that's it. You actually have to decide to believe.
Yeah.
In a way, that the gift of this moment that we're in right now, what Charles Taylor talks about as a cross-pressured imminent frame, meaning a time when, let's say, like in the West, Christian faith is not a given, but like a gift of that is that like we're more honest about the fact that it's not just automatic. You have to decide to believe, recognizing that just because you decided doesn't mean it comes easily, but you have to work at it. And what I would say is that those who don't believe, if we want to even use that framework, are also making a choice.
Yeah.
It may be the case that atheist scholars might say that, no, that's the default. That's just reality. No, I would say either way, you're making a choice. Which worldview do you want to subscribe to? Do you want to subscribe to the idea that we have souls, that lump in your throat that you feel is something connected to the transcendent and to one another? Or do you want to believe that it can never be anything more than chemical reactions that occurred completely randomly and senselessly? Either way, you're making a decision, you're making a choice. And so that's just to say that, like, yes, you are someone who inspires other people, and maybe people might be inspired by my story, but they should never mistake that for like, oh, wow, I wish I were like them.
Right. Right. That's probably what I'm reacting to.
And that doesn't mean that you, listener, should become a Jesuit or a Franciscan. Maybe you should, maybe you shouldn't. But what it does mean is that, like, it's available to you. It's there for you to grow deeper in your faith and to be transformed and to live more radically in this way. That's not a privilege just given to some.
Right. Yeah. It's actually who, like, all of us are meant to just truly be ourselves, but we have to make decisions to do so. We do.
Yep.
We have to do things with intention. It's looping back to that, noticing what makes us alive and making choices and making those choices with authenticity, with joy, with intention. Also in a way that reflects the humility and the woundedness of Christ that we've named as well. So yeah, our conversation has been rich today. Thank you so much, Cyrus, for joining. Before we conclude, I just would like to ask if there's anything else you would like to say about the messiness of being a Christian disciple.
I really appreciate our conversation as well. And I feel like we could have a podcast episode to go on 5 times as long because there's so many things to talk about.
Right.
Yeah, no, I mean, I would say, just to repeat the invitation for those who are busy and whose lives are busy and whose lives are messy, which all of ours are, but I don't have kids, I don't have a spouse on top of work and whatever. So I recognize, like, people have really wild commitments and amounts of things to do. I do want to just repeat the invitation to folks to try the Examen as a prayer that can fit into any part of your day and can accommodate any lifestyle in the sense that it is short and it helps us to see the messiness, in the messiness, to find God. That helped me to be a better disciple, and I have no doubt that it would for anyone else. So one final thing I should say is that in addition, Julia, to getting to know you over this past year here in Chicago, I'm also so glad to be a new fan of this podcast. So great job.
Thank you, Cyrus.
Yeah.
Thanks for coming on the show. Thanks for being my friend.
Thank you. Likewise.
Yeah. Messy Jesus Business is produced and edited by Colin Wamskans. You can find us online at messyjesusbusiness.com and on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Patreon. If you like what you heard, please be sure to mention our podcast to your friends and followers. And we'd love to have your support via Patreon. From the bottom of our hearts and the middle of the mess, thank you. Messy Jesus Business is produced in partnership with the Franciscan Sisters of Perpetual Adoration. You can learn more about our religious community and donate to our mission at www.fspa.org. I'm Sister Julia Walsh, and I'll catch up with you next time. Until then, peace and all good.